Without further delay, I will do a quick introduction on our speaker for tonight. You will recognize our special guest from his more than 200 appearances on national television. You might even recognize his voice. He has done more than 1,000 radio interviews, and while he's not a comedian, portions of his speeches are actually played on Sirius XM's comedy channels multiple times every day. He is Andy Andrews. He's the author of more than 25 books that have been translated into more than 40 languages. Among those books are several New York Times bestsellers, including the modern-day classics The Traveler's Gift and The Noticer. On ABC's Good Morning America, The Traveler's Gift was named one of the 5 books you must read in your lifetime. He has been to the White House on several occasions and has spoken at the request of different presidents of the United States. He coached our nation's Special Operations Command for 8 years and has been a part of 9 college football national championship teams in a row. He works as a consultant to Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, and sometimes entire communities who hire him to create a starting point for extraordinary results. His newest book, Just Jones, Sometimes a Thing is Impossible Until It's Actually Done, released September 8th, 2020. New York Times reporter recently wrote, Andy Andrews has quietly become one of the most influential people in America. So we are going to watch a speech that Andy gave at as part of the last year's Rotary District Conference. And I'm going to mute everybody while that's going on. So here we go.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Well, let me tell you a bit about myself to set the stage. I lived a pretty average life until I was 19 years old, and both my parents died during the same year. My mom from cancer, my dad was killed in a car accident. As you might imagine, this was an awful time, but I've always had the ability to take a bad situation and make it worse. And I did. I made some bad choices and ended up literally homeless before that was even a word. 35 years ago, nobody was talking about homeless people. It wasn't a term anybody used. But I was sleeping under a pier on the Gulf Coast and in and out of people's garages, which is not safe or smart, but I did. It was during that time I ran into an old man. He was under my pier, scared me to death. But he was the kind of guy that, you didn't know whether he's 80 or 180. And we didn't really know where he came from because we'd seen him in and out of town, but we didn't know where he went when he left town. We didn't know where he stayed when he was in town. He wore jeans and a t-shirt and like sandals. They always seemed to be clean, but that's all he ever wore. And he had kind of longish white hair and crystal blue eyes. We didn't know what was in the suitcase he carried around. He never let us touch it. But he was the first person to tell me the truth about myself. And when I say that, sometimes people go, oh, what does that mean? Well, when you meet somebody having a tough time, what do? You give them $5, you buy them a meal, you put them on the prayer list at church. But rarely do you sit down with them and tell them things about themselves that will make them angry at you. And that's what he did. And people ask me sometimes, they say, so he made you angry? He made you mad? Oh, yes, all the time. All the time. His name was Jones. We call him Jones, not Mr. Jones, just Jones. And he said he was a noticer. He said, when God was passing out talents, I didn't get the cool ones. I can't run fast. I can't sing great, but I notice little things that make a difference in people's lives. He started me reading I had always been like I guess a Field and Stream Sports Illustrated kind of person. And I didn't really read a lot of books. And I especially hated biographies. And I don't know why I hated them. I guess I hated them because the teachers made us read them and I didn't see the point. But one night he gave me 3 books and I knew they were biographies the second he handed them to me because they were hardbacks without the dust cover on them. And they just had names on them. And I never will forget, it was Winston Churchill, George Washington Carver, and Will Rogers. And I said, biographies? And he said, no, these are adventure stories. These are mysteries and romances and thrillers. And they're all true. And I said, oh. He said, yeah, they're from the library. When you get through with them, take them back. So I actually started that night reading the Winston Churchill one. I didn't really intend to read it. I was just going to read a little bit. So, because I knew that he would ask me. I knew he would say, are you reading the books? And I wanted to be able to say, yes, I'm reading Churchill. But I got into the book, and right near the first, it said something like it, that Winston met a little girl named Clementine, and little did he know that one day she would be his first lady when he was prime minister. And I remember thinking, well, there's the romance. And then every time the chapters were not long, but every time I would get to the end of the chapter was always something like, and if Winston had only known what was in the next room, he would have never walked through the door. And I would be like, oh my gosh, I'd have to read. And I would think, well, there's the mystery. And then the World War II stuff started, and I'm thinking, there's the thriller, there's the adventure. And I knew I was thinking these things because he had said it. But I was also aware I was still thinking them. And it was legitimate, my thoughts about these books. And I got hooked on them. I ended up reading over 200 books, 200 biographies of these happy, influential, financially secure, great people. I was reading books about great people, which when I say that, it makes me think, do they do books of any other kind of people? Not a loser section at Barnes and Noble, is there? But I would read these books trying to think, what is it about these people? Were they born this way, or was it something they did? And if it was something they did, what did they do? I identified 7 things, and those 7, I called them things. I knew there weren't 7 theories or 7 ideas or 7 habits, and I found out later there were principles. But I took those 7 things, and those are the 7 things that I eventually used to pull myself out from under that pier. There's 7 decisions that I used to write the book, The Traveler's Gift. And years later, I wrote about a book about Jones that became a New York Times bestseller and has now been translated into more than 40 languages. It's called The Noticer. I remember completing the manuscript for the book and being a little bit troubled by the fact that there were so many incredible moments with Jones that I hadn't been able to include. After all, he had done nothing less than change absolutely everything about my life and my future. I needn't have worried. The conversation that I'm about to reveal to you deserved a book of its own anyway. Jones said one day, with a little perspective, you can live a life of permanent purpose. When I asked what he meant, the old man answered with a question. He said, do you sometimes find yourself unconsciously judging your actions by a level of importance? I frowned a bit. I wasn't sure that I understood. And for instance, he continued, for instance, the time you spend with friends is important, but the time you spend with family is more important. You might rank an hour fishing as very important. 30 minutes visiting a sick friend in the hospital, much more important than the fishing. And a 60-second conversation with a convenience store clerk is not very important at all. So I nodded that I understood. And he returned to his initial point. He said, when you know that everything matters, that every move counts as much as any other, you will begin living a life of permanent purpose. A life of permanent purpose will make you a better parent, a better spouse, and a more valuable friend. Your productivity and financial success will soar to new heights while the old days of uncertainty and doubt and depression fade into the past. Of course, that conversation with Jones changed me. But even more, it became the guiding force that produced the kind of communicator and author I've become. You see, I understand fully that my value as an author and a communicator must ultimately be judged by the success you achieve. And as I consult with companies or speak to organizations and teams, I'm very aware that much of my clients' ability to succeed beyond imagination depends upon my ability to prove this very concept. When a sales organization sees proof that casual conversations in town matter just as much as an arranged meeting with a major prospect, when the second string left guard sees proof that his every action on and off the field in practice, whether or not he plays in the game, is as critical to the team's successful season as everything the starting quarterback does. When a teenager sees and understands proof that every choice made in casual situations today will affect the choices that will be available to them in the future. When one lives a life of permanent purpose, sales figures soar, team chemistry thrives, and teenage decisions become wiser and more cautious. And these are just a few examples of what will happen. Simply put, when we understand that every action matters, every result of our actions immediately improve. In this time we have together, I hope you will find hope and direction for yourself, but I'm most excited that you will now be equipped to lead others to their own life of permanent purpose. I hope for our families, our places of worship, our businesses, our nations, and our world is an incredible life of permanent purpose that can be achieved when at last we understand every move we make and every action we take matters, not just for us, but for all of us and for all time. Okay, here we go. Do you remember the song that goes, "One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do"? It's amazing when you think about it. Harry Nilsson wrote this piece of music about the smallest number in the world, one. Three Dog Night recorded it as a single, and the song was a huge hit. Of course, one isn't just small and lonely. That number packs a lot of power. Yes, one second, 1 degree, one idea, one flap of a butterfly's wings, one more. Yeah, that would be 2. And there's a canyon of difference between 1 and 2. From 1967 to 1973, the UCLA men's basketball team under John Wooden won 7 national championships in a row. That's right, 7. 7 consecutive times the team ended the season at number 1. Now, can you name any of the teams that claimed the number 2 spot? No? Well, me either. The Olympics have been contested for well over a century. And they've been the source of many memorable, even legendary moments for many of us. I wonder how many gold medalists you can name. Now make a list of the silver medalists you can remember. Don't feel bad. I can't name more than a couple either. But that's the point, isn't it? There's a big difference between one and two. How about one idea? The airplane, penicillin, air conditioning, the computer, before they were physical, workable realities, these examples and a million more life-changing inventions or discoveries were merely ideas. In fact, each was one idea. It's an empowering realization. In order to change your life, all you need is one idea. One idea will change everything. One idea can change the world. You and I have seen one idea make billions of dollars. We've seen one idea save millions of lives, and one idea can move you from where you are to where you want to be. Incidentally, don't ever allow yourself to believe that all the great ideas have been taken. Never forget that as a society, we put men on the moon before anybody thought to put wheels on luggage. So, what one idea is out there waiting patiently for you to show up? Or consider not just the power of one, but the power of a fraction of one. When considering financial reward or future opportunities, is there also a significant gap in those items between first and second place? Of course there is, but how much of a gap? The financial difference in the opportunities offered to a gold medalist versus a silver medalist is hard to quantify considering the variety of Olympic sports that are contested, but it's clear that Michael Phelps has more of life's opportunities personally and in business because he won gold medals than if he had only won silver. I mean, decades after winning gold medals, athletes like Mary Lou Retton, Sugar Ray Leonard, Michelle Kwan, Carl Lewis, Peggy Fleming, and Micah Ruzioni are all remembered and revered. They also continue to be well compensated. In fact, many gold medalists are paid tens of thousands of dollars merely to stand in front of a group of people and recount their athletic experiences. The silver medalists, not so often. Okay, you say, that's all very obvious. What is the point? Well, the point is very simple, but for some reason, it's often missed in our almost constant struggle to understand that ever popular big picture. You see, the point of demonstrating the chasm between first and second place is not to illustrate the financial difference or even to show the financial reward produced over time by lasting fame. No, if you and I are to become extraordinary achievers, we must learn to recognize the little things that actually create the gap and consequently the difference in opportunities between one and two. Astonishingly, these little things that most people see as irrelevant sometimes occur days or even weeks in advance of the actual event. And know this, the difference between first and second place is most often ridiculously small. In fact, there are multiple Olympic sports in which the difference between first place and 10th place is less than a second. At the Olympic Games in Beijing, American swimmer Michael Phelps won his 7th gold medal by 1/100th of a second. Think about it. 1/100th of a second is smaller than the amount of time it takes lightning to strike. It takes more than 1/100th of a second for a hummingbird to flap its wings one time. The blink of an eye takes longer than 1/100th of a second. Here's the truth that average achievers never bother to consider. The advantage in any arena of life is earned far in advance of the moment one is required to perform. The truth about Phelps' race is that the tiny burst that propelled him to victory was acquired in an almost imperceptible manner. It might have been one more swallow of coffee that morning, or one more practice lap the week before, or 5 minutes of additional rest here or there. Or could it have been a thought? All activity and movement are initiated in the brain. Had Phelps allowed a negative thought during the race, might that momentary doubt have added 2/100ths of a second to his time? Or was a positive thought quietly whispered to himself on the starting blocks responsible for the 100th of a second that made the difference in gold and silver? For winning that particular race, Phelps' sponsor, Speedo, presented him with a check for $1 million, which he promptly gave to charity. So, whatever Phelps did and whenever he did it, you can be certain that the difference it made was hugely valuable and incredibly small. Small, seemingly insignificant, like the flap of a butterfly's wing. In 1963, Edward Lorenz presented a hypothesis to the New York Academy of Science. His theory, stated simply, was that a butterfly could flap its wings and set molecules of air in motion, which would move other molecules of air, in turn moving more molecules of air, eventually capable of starting a hurricane on the other side of the planet. Lorenz and his ideas were literally laughed out of the conference. What he had proposed was ridiculous. It was preposterous, but it was fascinating. Therefore, because of the idea's charm and intrigue, the so-called butterfly effect became a staple of science fiction, remaining for decades a combination of myth and urban legend spread only by comic books and bad movies. So imagine the scientific community's shock and surprise when more than 30 years after the possibility was introduced, physics professors working from colleges and universities worldwide came to the conclusion that the butterfly effect was authentic, accurate, and viable. Soon after, it was accorded the status of a law, just like the law of gravity is now known as the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. And this principle has proven to be a force encompassing more than mere butterfly wings. Science has shown the butterfly effect to engage with the first movement of any form of matter, including people. Did you know that there once existed a single man who, a century and a half ago, made one move that still dramatically affects how you live today? He was a 34-year-old school teacher, but on this hot, humid day of July 2nd, 1863, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was in the fight of his life. A former professor of rhetoric from Bowdoin College in Maine, he was now a colonel in the Union Army. Chamberlain stood at the far left edge of a group of 80,000 men strung out in a line across the fields and hills stretching all the way to a little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Earlier that day, a Colonel Vincent had placed Chamberlain and his men of the 20th Maine at the end of the line, saying, whatever you do, you can't let them come through here. Chamberlain couldn't withdraw, and he knew it. If the Confederate Army overran them, the rebels would gain the high ground, and the Union Army would be quickly defeated. In essence, 80,000 men would be caught from behind on a downhill charge with no protection. To win, the gray-clad Confederates would have to come through Chamberlain. At 2:30 p.m., there in the afternoon, that first charge came from the 15th and 47th Alabama regiments. They attacked uphill, running as fast as they could and firing at Chamberlain's men, who were stationed behind a rock wall they had thrown up that very morning. The 20th Maine stopped the rebel charge and pushed them back down the slope, only to face a second, then a third charge. On the fourth assault, Chamberlain was knocked down by a bullet that hit him dead center, right in the belt buckle. Realizing he wasn't seriously hurt, the colonel scrambled to his feet, continued to fight. And again, they halted the enemy's charge. And again, the rebels retreated down the hill. Now, at that time in history, battles were fought with artillery and small arms ammunition. The struggles were close, face-to-face affairs. With the fourth charge, the Confederates almost made it to the wall. It was a thigh-high stack of flat rocks that ran almost 110 yards in length. As they waited for the next charge, Chamberlain felt sorry for his men. He later recalled, Their leader had no real knowledge of warfare and tactics. He thought I was only a stubborn man, and that was my greatest advantage in this fight. I had deep within me the inability to do nothing. And Chamberlain continued his thoughts. He said, I knew I may die, but I also knew I would not die with a bullet in my back. I would not die in retreat. I am, he thought, at least like the Apostle Paul, who wrote, "This one thing I do, I press toward the mark." The attack came again. On this, the fifth charge, the 15th and 47th Alabama broke open the wall and fighting raged on both sides. Without time to reload, the men were swinging their rifles at each other and brawling with their fists and knives. Somehow, the 20th Maine pushed the rebels downhill another time. After that fifth broken charge, Chamberlain's younger brother, Tom, appeared with Sergeant Tozier. As an old, hard-nosed soldier, Tozier had a thick wad of torn shirt stuck into a hole in his shoulder where he'd been wounded. "No help from the 83rd, the sergeant said. "They're shot to ribbons, and all they can do is extend the line a bit. We're getting murdered on our flank." "Can we extend?" Chamberlain asked. "There's nothing to extend," Tom answered. "More than half our men are down." It was true. Chamberlain's command had started in Bangor, Maine 6 months earlier with 1,000 men. They'd started that morning with 300. Now they were down to 80. "How are we for ammunition?" the colonel asked. "We've been shooting a lot," was his brother's answer. "I know we've been shooting a lot," Chamberlain snapped. "I want to know how we're holding out. How much ammunition do we have left?" As Tom ran to check, a 12-year-old lookout had climbed a tree. Now, you moms, think about a 12-year-old being with this group of men. He climbed the tree, and this 12-year-old yelled, "They're forming up again! Colonel, they're forming up again!" Chamberlain looked up to see the boy pointing down the hill. "They're forming right now, and they've been reinforced, sir. There's a lot more of them this time." At that moment, a messenger stumbled into their midst. Out of breath, he said, "Sir, Colonel Chamberlain, sir, Colonel Vincent is dead." "Are you sure, soldier?" "Yes, sir," he gasped. "He was shot right at the first of the fight. They were firmed up by Weed's brigade, but now Weed's is dead. They moved Hazlett's battery up too. Hazlett's dead now too." Chamberlain's brother came running back. "Joshua," he said, "we're out. 1-2 rounds per man at the most. Some of the men don't have anything at all." Chamberlain turned to a thin man standing on his right. It was First Sergeant Ellis Spear. "Spear," he ordered, "tell the boys to take ammunition from the wounded and the dead." "We did that last time, sir," Spear replied. "Maybe we should think about pulling out." Chamberlain responded grimly. He said, "We will not be pulling out, Sergeant. Carry out my orders, please." "Colonel," Sergeant Tozier spoke up, "we won't hold them again, sir. You know we won't." "Joshua," it was his brother, "here they come. Here they come." Chamberlain stepped to the top of the wall in full view, crossing his arms and staring down at the advancing enemy. The 15th and 47th Alabama, with their pale yellow-gray uniforms, were now reinforced by a Texas regiment, and they moved up the hill as their high-pitched shriek, that rebel yell, chorused up toward Chamberlain and his men. Sergeant Spear was standing at the colonel's feet. And Sergeant Tozier, Chamberlain's brother Tom, and Lieutenant Melcher, the flag bearer, were huddled below. "Joshua," his brother said, "do something. Give an order." Chamberlain stood there for a moment, deep in thought, quickly sorting the situation. "We can't retreat," he thought. "We can't stay here. When I'm faced with the choice of doing nothing or doing something, I will always choose to act." He turned his back on the advancing rebels, looked down at his men, and said, "Fix bayonets." At first, no one moved. They just stared at him with their mouths open. "Fix bayonets," he commanded again. "Execute a great right wheel of the entire regiment. Swing the left first. Do it now." Lieutenant Melcher spoke first. He was confused. "Sir," he asked, "what is a great right wheel?" But the colonel had already jumped from the wall and was moving to the next group of men. Sergeant Tozier answered the question. "The great right wheel is a charge, son. This crazy man is about to charge." Then turning, the colonel pointed his sword directly downhill. Facing overwhelming odds, Chamberlain slashed his blade through the air, and with the power born of courage and fear, the school teacher from Maine roared, "Charge, charge, charge, get him!" to his men. The remaining 80 fighting men lifted their voices to match that of their leader. "Charge, charge," they cried. They're tumbling over the wall into a history about which most people in our country have never heard. For when the Confederate troops saw Chamberlain, the leader of the opposition, mount the wall, they immediately stopped. They were unsure as to what was happening. And when the colonel pointed his sword toward them and commanded his men to charge, they turned and ran. Many threw down their loaded weapons. The rebels were certain these were not the same soldiers we've been facing. Surely they thought, these men have been reinforced. A beaten regiment would not charge. In less than 5 minutes, Chamberlain had his sword on the collarbone of a Confederate captain. "You, sir, are my prisoner," he stated. The man turned around a fully loaded Navy Colt revolver and offered it to Chamberlain. "Yes, sir," he answered. "I am." Within 5 more minutes, that ragged group of 80 men under Chamberlain's command, 80 men without ammunition, had captured over 400 of the enemy. A few minutes later, Chamberlain passed a private who was guarding 100 of the enemy under an oak tree. The private whispered, "Sir, I have no ammunition in my rifle." Chamberlain whispered back, "Well, for God's sake, don't tell them." It's an amazing story, isn't it? And it's absolutely true. But here's what most people never consider. Historians have determined that had Chamberlain not charged that day, the rebels would have won at Gettysburg. Furthermore, historians tell us had the Confederacy won at Gettysburg, the South would have won the war, and the war itself would have been over by the end of the summer. Most people assume that had the South won the war, today we would exist as two countries, the Union and the Confederacy, the North and the South. Historians, however, insist that if the South had won the war, we would now live in a territorially fragmented continent, much like Europe. North America would be divided into 9 to 13 countries, which means had Chamberlain not charged on that afternoon so long ago, when Hitler swept across Europe in the 1940s, there would not have existed a United States of America to stand in the breach. When Hirohito systematically invaded the islands of the South Pacific, there wouldn't have been a united anything. There wouldn't have been a country big enough, strong enough, wealthy enough, and populous enough to fight and win 2 wars on 2 fronts at the same time. The United States of America exists as it does today because of a single man, one 34-year-old school teacher, and one move he made a century and a half ago. You see, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is a human example of the butterfly effect. One man who made one move, whose effects still ripple through your life today. And you are no less an example of the butterfly effect than Chamberlain was. Everything you do matters. Every move you make, every action you take matters. Not just to you or your family or your business or your hometown. Everything you do matters to all of us and forever. On Friday, April 2nd, 2004, I'll never forget. I was in a hotel room. I had hurried in. I was in a hurry. The television was on. I was ironing the left sleeve of a white shirt. And ABC News was honoring a man who at that time was 91 years old. The news program was running this regular segment called The Person of the Week. And usually the honorees' accomplishments are listed in advance. And by the time the name is announced, most folks have already guessed the identity of that week's winner. In this instance, however, the pronouncement left many viewers puzzled. And so our person of the week is, the anchorman finally said, Norman Borlaug. I mean, you can only imagine the frowns. Like, who? Who did he say? Norman, what was the last name? Yet, despite most people's unfamiliarity, I knew who he was. I had done some research and followed a rabbit trail down into this place. I found Norman Borlaug is the man who's personally responsible for drastically and dramatically changing the world in which we live. See, in the early 1940s, Norman Borlaug hybridized high-yield, disease-resistant corn and wheat for arid climates. From the Dust Bowl of Western Africa to our own desert Southwest, from South and Central America to the plains of Siberia, across Europe and Asia, Borlaug's specific seed product flourished and regenerated where no seed had ever thrived before. Through the years, it's now been calculated that Norman Borlaug's work saved from famine more than 2 billion lives. Think about that. The guy saved 2 billion lives. And for that, he was person of the week. Actually, it was never reported. But I was sitting there yelling at the television because the anchorman was misinformed. It wasn't Norman Borlaug who saved the 2 billion people, though very few caught the mistake, I'm sure. It was a man named Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the vice president of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. Now, wait a minute. People say, I thought Harry Truman was vice president under Roosevelt. Well, that's true. But remember, Roosevelt was elected 4 times. And he had 3 different vice presidents. Truman was the last one, but the second man to serve as Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 45 was Henry Wallace. Wallace was the former Secretary of Agriculture who, after his one term as vice president, was dumped from the ticket in favor of Truman. Okay, so while Wallace was vice president, however, he used the power of that office to create a station in Mexico whose sole purpose was to hybridize corn and wheat for arid climates. And he hired a young man named Norman Borlaug to run it. So Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize, and Norman Borlaug was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But considering the connection, it was really Henry Wallace that saved the 2 billion people, wasn't it? Unless it was George Washington Carver. You remember Carver, don't you? The peanut? But here's something very few people know. When Carver was 19 years old and a student at Iowa State University, he had a dairy sciences professor who on Saturday and Sunday afternoons would allow his 6-year-old boy to go on botanical expeditions with this brilliant student. It was George Washington Carver who took that boy and instilled in him a love for plants and a vision for what they could do for humanity. It was George Washington Carver who pointed 6-year-old Henry Wallace's life in a specific direction long before he ever thought about becoming vice president of the United States. It's amazing to contemplate, isn't it? George Washington Carver flapping his butterfly wings with the peanut. There are 266 things he developed from the peanut that we still use today. He flapped his wings with the sweet potato, 88 things from the sweet potato that Carver originated that we still use today. And while no one was even looking, George Washington Carver flapped his butterfly wings a couple of times with a 6-year-old boy and just happened to save the lives of more than 2 billion people and counting. So maybe it should have been George Washington Carver that was person of the week. Unless it would have been the farmer from Diamond, Missouri. It was a guy named Moses And he and his wife, Susan, lived in a slave state, but they didn't believe in slavery. So this was a problem for the psychopaths like Quantrill's raiders who terrorized the area by destroying property and burning and killing. And sure enough, one cold January night, Quantrill's raiders rode through Moses and Susan's farm. They burned the barn, they shot several people, and dragged off a woman named Mary Washington, who refused to let go of her infant son, George. Mary Washington was Susan's best friend. She was distraught. Moses was probably ADD like me. And so it was Susan who sent messages and messengers, getting the word out through neighbors and towns. And 2 days later, she managed to secure a meeting with Quantrill's raiders. So she sent her husband on a black horse several hours north to a crossroads in Kansas, where there at the appointed time in the middle of the night, he met 4 of Quantrill's raiders. They were on horseback, carrying torches with flour sacks tied over their heads with holes cut out for their eyes. There Moses traded the only horse he had left on his farm for what they threw him in a burlap bag. As they thundered off on their horses, Moses fell to his knees, and there, alone in that dark winter night, the farmer pulled from the bag a cold, naked, almost dead baby boy. And quickly, he jerked open his coat and his shirts and placed the child next to his skin, and covering him with his own clothes and relying on the warmth from his own body, he turned and he walked that baby out. Moses trudged through the night and into the next day to get the child to safety. And when he finally stumbled through the door at home, he placed the baby in the arms of his wife, and they put him on a blanket near the fireplace. There they prayed over this child and promised God that if he would let this baby live, they would raise him as their own. They promised that baby that they would see that he was educated to honor his mother, who they knew was already dead. And that was the moment that they gave that baby their name. And that's how Moses and Susan Carver came to raise that little baby, George Washington. So when you think about it, maybe it was a farmer's wife from Diamond, Missouri, who saved 2 billion people. Unless, is there an ending to this story? I mean, not really. How far back could we go, right? I mean, when you think about it, exactly who was it that saved 2 billion lives? Is there a specific person to whom we could point? How far back would we have to go? How many lives would we need to examine in order to determine who really was the person whose action saved 2 billion people, a number that continues to increase every minute? And how far forward would we need to go in your life to show the difference you will make? There are generations yet unborn whose very lives will be shifted and shaped by the moves you make and the actions you take today and tomorrow and the next day and the next. Because every single thing you do matters. You have been created as one of a kind. On the planet Earth, there has never been one like you, and there never will be again. Your spirit, your thoughts and feelings, your ability to reason and act all exist in no one else. The rarities that make you special are no mere accident or quirk of fate. You have been created in order that you might make a difference. You have within you the power to change the world. Know that your actions cannot be hoarded, saved for later, or used selectively. By your hand, millions, billions of lives will be altered, caught up in a chain of events begun by you this day. The very beating of your heart has meaning and purpose. Your actions have value far greater than silver or gold. Your life and what you do with it today matters forever.
All right.
That was amazing.
Thank you for working through the technical difficulties, but just a great message. As we know, those Rotary speakers are inspiring. So great to hear from him. Yes, Claudia.
I just have a backstory to this. So when we were looking at who we would want to speak for the conference last year, we knew it was going to be virtual, right? So how do we get people join us for a full day of doing exactly this, sitting here and want to be captivated? And I want to just share with you like why, as I chaired the conference the last 3 years, this was the guy who I really felt could bring the feels to Rotarians, whether it was those who joined us, right, that day, or those who would hear his message months, years, I heard this man at an event about, gosh, my oldest daughter is going to be 25, Mike, is that correct? Oh my gosh, yes. Oh my gosh, she's going to be 25.
25 soon.
Yeah, so she was little. So I heard him when she was 2 years old. And I was at a conference and he just spoke a different message, but I was like, wow. And so I followed and read all of his books, and they were just motivational and inspirational for those of you who like that kind of stuff. But his message is always the delivery is amazing, the way that he delivers it through stories and comedy and whatnot. So for district conference, he did not disappoint at all. We had the fortune of having him do 2 different. He started the conference and ended the conference. So this is one of the 2. We'll make sure to link the second one. Amazing, and I just could not be more thankful that as I was looking at all of your faces tonight, I was like, okay, I saw smiles, I saw like ahas, I saw like points, but they're all good. And that's what we saw during our conference. We had a record-breaking Zoom conference of people joining, and these videos will live on. But that's definitely a very, very proud moment of getting him to say yes and to give us a discount on our budget. It was amazing. So anyway, that's all I have to say.
It's a great story, Claudia. Thank you for sharing that.